Well, it was that time of year again, no two ways about it. Krassmiss, which is what people called Christmas back then, was just around the corner. Pretty soon the nights would get real dark and the snowfall would come, either whirling down like a dervish or dropping like flower petals. Either way it would come, and people would move back indoors again. They'd build their houses for just this occasion, something they'd been doing for generations, in fact. And it was a time of particular anxiety for a lot of folk because they had to snatch the best tree for their clans to build their houses around. Nobody knew where this tradition came from, but it probably arose due to the fact that they liked being outside in the woods, so if they had to stay cooped up indoors during the long winter time, they might as well try to bring the woods into their homes with them as best as they could, and this meant getting the best tree in the forest. Well, things were mighty different this year, however, for the clans agreed not to shed blood this time in their struggle for prime real estate. Having survived an especially bitter feud, the Beaumarchais clan and the Walk and Chew Gum clan both made a joint proposal to the General Assembly to settle any tree disputes real peaceful, like real civilized folk. So the elders of the village put their egg noggins together to come up with a solution, and the best thing they could come up with was a kind of friendly, non-lethal competition. Old Horwitz of the Cobalt clan was the one who came up with the idea that they would hold a race to catch a star and put it on the top of the tree to claim it. Most of them thought he was crazy, because stars, as everybody knew, were too far away to catch, but he said he'd seen one close up once back when he was young Horwitz. "Horwitz, you old jelly bean," they would tease him, especially Big Mary. "That's the biggest load of horseradish we've ever heard." "Is not," said Horwitz, "and I'll prove it to you, just you wait." But they all laughed and said Horwitz had been drinking too much tulip wine again. Well, it seems Horwitz's time had come, but he was too old and infirm to prove it. However, that was no obstacle to the younger folk, who just loved this idea because it meant they could show off their physical prowess. You know how young people are. So, if there was a tree dispute, and there always was a tree dispute, then the families involved would select their best, strongest, fittest members to compete. Well, it just so happened that this year the best, biggest tree came into dispute by 3 different clans: the Cobalt clan, the Sunspot clan, and the Does It Again clan. Now, from the Cobalt clan, the obvious choice was good old Bare Hands Nikolai. Now, Bare Hands got that name on account of his hands looking like they belonged to a great big grizzly bear. So big and hairy-knuckled they were, but mighty useful for the kind of manly work required of him, chopping wood and carrying logs across the valley all the livelong day, yes sir. He also had a large, muscular frame. Really, he was not just bare hands, but bare all over on account of his size. Truthfully, he had more the physique of a silverback gorilla than a bear, but gorillas had not been invented yet, so they had to make do with what they had to describe him. However, he did not have the face of a bear, no sir. People said Nikolai's was the face of a cherub, though nobody had ever actually seen a cherub or actually knew what a cherub was. Most people reckoned a cherub was like some kind of raccoon, but with a sweet, humble demeanor that sometimes got into trouble, the odd fisticuffs now and then, but had a good heart at the end of the livelong day. All this was to say that cherubs, whatever they were, must have resembled Bare Hands Nikolai. At least that's what old Horwitz said, and he was the clan wise guy after all was said and done, so they believed him, yes they did. Anyways, Bare Hands was widely believed to be the strongest not only of the Cobalt clan, but of the entire village. And they reckoned that a star would take some mighty strength to haul down from the heavens. So Bare Hands Nikolai was their man. Well, this was all well and good for Bare Hands, who was still young and eager to prove himself. That is, until he learned who was his direct competitor. It was none other than little Bluest Feather of the Sunspot clan. Now, Bluest Feather was a quietly intense one, and she loved gazing up at the stars better than anything else. Some said she was born without eyelids because she became so focused on objects of her attention that she neglected her blinking duties. This was of course nonsense and slander, for she had been born with all her parts eyelids included, although it was perhaps the case that she had something of an astigmatism in her left eye, but not much to be done about that until lens grinders decided to exist, so until then she just had to make do with her egg-shaped eyeball. Perhaps this was why she looked so intently at things, for she could not always see them clearly at a passing glance. It is curious that she was called Bluest Feather, for she had on her head a shock of bright red hair, looking like she had stuck her finger in what folk in later times would call an electrical socket. And in spite of her otherworldly nature, she was also mighty swift. The notion that she had lightning coursing through her veins helped her growing reputation for being the fastest of the Sunspot clan, and probably the whole village if one really was being honest about it, and I will be. The Sunspots reckoned it was a race after all, and what they needed more than any other quality was swiftness. So the sooner she went and got that star, the sooner she would be back, no question about it. She was happy to do it, for though she was not a competitive type, she was keen on doing some exploring, for the valley had gotten a bit small and cramped for her, how could it not? So that was all well and good for little Bluest Feather, until she discovered who she was competing against, which was none other than our bare hands Nikolai. You see, the problem I have not mentioned heretofore was that Bluest Feather and Nikolai were secretly in love, which proved to be mighty inconvenient for the upkeep of the clan rivalry and all. So they had to be clandestine lovers or nothing at all, real Romeo and Juliet-like. So they had what might be a conflict of interest on their hands here. Now the biggest obstacle was their third competitor, none other than Lady John of the Does It Again clan. Oh, that Lady John. She was particularly a thorn in Bare Hand's side, for though Nikolai was strong and stout-hearted, he was not the sharpest arrow in the quiver, and there Lady John had him beat. Lady John was smart, and she often reminded Nikolai of that fact. She was very cunning, though her great flaw was that she was pathologically lazy, that one. But she got away with it, yes sir, for as well as being smart, she was charming as all get out, and she could talk her way out of any tricky situation. Her and Nikolai had gone way back, and if not bosom buddies, were still schoolyard chums of one sort or another. But their difference in aptitude may not have troubled old Bare Hands, except that Lady John, being as beguiling as she was, had caught the eye of none other than Bluest Feather herself, who seemed to be smitten with Lady John, even though she professed to love none other than Bare Hands. Now this more than rankled Nikolai, who hoped to be Bluest Feather's only sweetheart. What was worse was that Lady John knew that she had caught Bluest Feather's eye, and Nikolai knew this, and Lady John knew that he knew, and he knew that she knew that he knew, and it just cut him deep to see Bluest Feather fawn over Lady John even when Nikolai was standing right next to her. For he knew Lady John loved nobody more than Lady John herself, though it seemed like Nikolai was the only one who noticed it. "Well, never you mind, Bare Hands," said his cousin and best friend, Afterface, from the clan of Raoul. "You just go out and fetch that star, and that Lady John won't ever trouble you or Bluest Feather again, you have my word." How Afterface knew this he could not say, but Nikolai did not question the logic of his cousin's encouraging word, as it was designed to be exactly the thing he wanted to hear as he prepared to go off into the unknown. So there they were, the three competitors for the biggest, most beautiful tree in the valley. But there was one more contender that none of them had counted on. Old Nickel and Dimes lived further away from the other clans. He didn't much like company. He felt that the valley had gotten so crowded. Why, it had only been a few centuries since the dawn of time, and already there must have been something like 1,000 people down there. He just couldn't handle the hustle and bustle of village life. He was a malcontent, if I may say so, and seemed to have no better than a heart of coal, pardon my saying so. This temperament made him act cantankerously toward others, and that, as well as his geographical separation from the village, convinced him that he was in fact superior to the folk in the valley, who in his eyes were chumps every last one of them, yes sir. In most of his dealings he cheated the villagers, having even swindled Bluest Feather's friend Porkbone Stew right out of his own shoes on more than one occasion, just for sport, and then told him he hid them way off in the hills so that poor Stew had to go looking for them, and it took him 5 days and 5 nights, yes it did, only to come back empty-handed and barefooted once more to learn that Nickel and Dimes had them with him the whole time. And if Porkbone Stew wanted his shoes back, he would have to do 3 days' worth of labor for them. And oh, how Nickel and Dimes did laugh a wicked laugh at that poor fellow. What skullduggery! But this, of course, was the face he presented to his peers, when in fact he was a sensitive fellow in his own way, who had simply been knocked around in life one too many times that he developed a thick wall of ice around his heart. Nickel and Dimes was lonely, for he had no clan of his own, and thus his education in how to get along with others was somewhat incomplete, you might say. He was also disgusted with the way the villagers behaved around this particular tradition, for he knew in the marrow of his bones, yes he did, that this just was not the way to act at this time of year, competing against one another, when what they really should have been doing was helping each other out. Of course, he would never have actually admitted that this was the nut of his displeasure for the whole business of Krassmiss, but he felt it in an inarticulate sort of way. It was a travesty, how could they not see it? Well, this year he would show them. He would show them all. What he did not plan for, however, was how his act of teaching them a lesson would in fact end up being the most generous thing anybody had ever done until then. But we'll get back to Nickel and Dimes later. So the day came, a month before Krassmiss, when they would declare the winner, and the victorious clan would build their winter shelter around the greatest tree in the valley. So off they went, bare hands Nikolai heading to the mountains in the north, for certainly he would catch a star if he was up there, bidding farewell to his clan and his good friend Afterface. Bluest Feather off to the east, toward the plains, where she had been told by Porkbone Stew that stars would fall on occasion right to the ground and could be picked up by any passers-by. Lady John went south, way south to the edge of the world. And Nickel and Dimes watched them all leave the valley one by one. He himself decided to head to the deep forest out west, which made the valley look like an amateur vegetable garden by comparison, yes it did. Well, you can imagine, it was not long before their troubles began. Nikolai had no trouble climbing up those mountains, sturdy as a mountain goat as he was. The trouble was when he got into the highest mountain range and discovered that the stars were still out of reach. Well, he wandered far and wide in those mountains, and the weather got worse and worse. It wasn't long before he couldn't even see the stars when he looked up, for it was obscured by impenetrable walls of swirling snow. Yes, sirree, he got lost in a blizzard real good, and all he could do was dig a hole in the ground to stay warm, and hope an avalanche didn't come along and bury him alive or dead. What did it matter to the avalanche? But mercy of mercies, of all the things that could have saved him, he would never have expected it to be this. He was found by a local Yeti who decided to take him in. And not just any Yeti, mind you, but Yellow Betty the Yeti and her husband, Nathan the Yeti. Well, they were going to eat him, but they just couldn't because he seemed so sweet, with his face like a cherub as it was. So instead they took him in and made him their friend instead. They saw he was in a bad way, so they nursed him back to health, feeding him on soup and yak's meat. They became good friends, which was a great benefit to Nikolai, for he was in sore need of help. He told them about his quest, and the competition, and how he was hunting for a star. The Yetis thought it was a rather juvenile endeavor, but they were so touched by the sincerity of Nikolai's spirit that they agreed to help him. Well, it just so happened that Yellow Betty the Yeti was a mighty industrious type Yeti who took full advantage of her opposable thumbs by building things. Yes, she mightily enjoyed working with her hands, building large wooden structures and small trinkets as well. Nikolai was especially taken with her woodworking skills. Nathan, on the other hand, though he was a fine hunter, was paradoxically also a lover of animals. He, in fact, had a team of reindeer he hitched to a chariot built by his spouse, dear Yellow Betty. In fact, that was how they found Bare Hands and took him back to their cave way up in the mountains. So they suggested taking Bare Hands out on the chariot to catch a good star for his village. They assured him the stars were within reach, but they had to get creative. So them being strong-armed types, the three of them came up with a strong-armed plan. They went out one night, when the blizzard subsided, and the sky was clear as crystal, and so bright you could read a book in the starlight if books had been discovered by then. They went speeding up the side of the highest peak in the range, and when they reached the top, while Nathan drove the reindeer, Yellow Betty picked up our hero, and with her huge furry arms, tossed Nikolai like a salad way up into the sky. He went high where things got a bit lighter, so he wouldn't drop immediately. Yes, sir, he went up above the clouds and almost crashed right into a star that was moving along in that particular hemisphere. Nikolai thought he heard the star give a yelp, and before they knew it, their combined weight sent them hurtling down toward the earth. Now, it was Nathan the Yeti's skill as a charioteer that saved Nikolai's neck that day, for just as Nikolai was about to drop down into a particularly deep crevasse, well, you guessed it, Nathan's reindeer leapt across the chasm, and Nikolai fell right back into Yellow Betty's arms, and the star came down after him. Nikolai was surprised by how easy it was to catch it. But it was once they got it back to the Yeti cave that they realized how difficult it would be to take back. The weight of it was not the issue. In fact, it was startlingly light for a thing its size, and were it smaller, Nikolai could have carried it on his back. But as it was not smaller, but in fact an enormous ball of light, he could not do it easily. It wasn't heavy, just awkward, he told the Yetis. Then the wise Yellow Betty had an idea, and cryptically asked Bare Hands a question. "Bare Hands," she said, "how do you eat an elephant?" "What's an elephant?" said Bare Hands. Yellow Betty palmed her face and said, "Never you mind what it is, just know that it's mighty big. So how do you eat something mighty big like an elephant?" To which Bare Hands said, "Well, that's easy. The same way I eat anything else, one bite at a time." And though he was not the brightest penny in the jar, after some long moments of puzzling out this seemingly irrelevant question, he exclaimed, "Oh, I should eat the star." And the Yetis whooped and hollered in celebration that Bare Hands had finally puzzled it out, for everybody knew that stars, of course, were edible. So he did just that and ate that star, though he couldn't be sure how long he would be able to keep it in. It tasted heavenly indeed, yes it did, like what we might call cotton candy, but cold and pure and refreshing. However, it did have some side effects. It burned his insides like fire and chilled them like ice. It gave him some terrible fever and chills. Was it worth the trouble, he wondered. But this seemed like the sensible thing to do, so he decided to just put up with it till he got back to the village. And so he said farewell to his Yeti friends and promised to come back to visit them sometime. Off he went, feeling mighty sick to his stomach. Now Lady John traveled south, as far south as one could go, till she reached the edge of the world. This was, of course, back in the day before the world was round, on account of globes had not been invented yet, so the earth tended to remain flat until people's knowledge of things had become more advanced, you might say. It was not advised that people should settle there, so it was a sparsely populated region, you can imagine, most people agreeing you couldn't be too cautious around the edge of the world, unless you didn't mind falling off of it, and then falling forever and ever, amen. But Lady John had a special hunch about it, reckoning that most folk would think, and rightly they would, that the stars would be above them, but they did not think much about where they went in the daytime. Yes, sir, Lady John was a clever one after all, so it occurred to her to see if she could catch a star down below, so to speak, which would save her the trouble of going up, which was just too dangerous after all was said and done. Now she reached her destination by taking a galley down the Yangtze River, which, as everybody knows, back in those days flowed all the way to the edge of the earth. And who knew where its waters went after that? She went climbing down some rocks beside the waterfall, and got as low as she could without going off entirely. Well, it was mighty dark down there, no two ways about it. The stars were up at the moment, it being night-time and all, so she had herself some waiting to do. Well, she waited and waited and waited. Yes, sir, she stared into the abyss, and the abyss stared back, and this went on for some time, a staring contest with the abyss, until the wheel of stars turned. Now you may be wondering how she planned on catching a star. Well, as everybody knows, one thing no star can resist is something sweet. And so she dipped her left toe in iced honey, using that as bait, because everyone knew that stars were kinky like that. She figured she could just sort of dangle her foot for a while and catch a snooze while the stars came nibbling at her toe like minnows. Now at this time the stars were moving past her foot like a school of luminous fish. She dangled her foot in among the stars as they passed by, some slowing down a bit to inspect the honey toe, but then carrying on. She managed to catch the attention of one star that came floating all the way up from the Andromeda galaxy, and was very interested in what Lady John had on offer. Well, it's a well-known fact by now that stars have very sharp teeth, and a bite as powerful as an alligator. But this is a fact that poor Lady John did not know in her time. In fact, it might be said she was the reason that we know this now, for no sooner did that star come up to lick the honey off her left toe did it clamp down so hard, well, it bit the toe clean off. Oh, poor Lady John! Sure, she may have caused some trouble for bare hands, but she didn't do a thing to deserve having her toe bitten off, and to say otherwise is overstepping the matter. Lucky for her, stars' teeth are like hot irons, so the wound was cauterized as soon as it was made, so she would not bleed to death. But still, what a terrible fate. She got her four-toed foot out right quick and cradled the thing in her lap. Oh, how it did smart! But when she looked down to shout swear words at that star, curse words that would make your mother blush and your grandmother cross herself, oh, she was ready with them swear words when she saw the star there, floating just below her rock, looking up at her like she was gonna feed it some more. This made her hold her poisoned tongue, for she had a fine idea. She decided to tie the rope to the whole pot of iced honey and lower that down instead of her foot. Well, the star didn't seem to like the pot as much as her toe, but it chomped down on the pot all the same. At this point, Lady John seized her chance and yanked the star up and out of the sky below. It wriggled and flopped about like a fish for a while, but oh, it did love that honey, so it did not let go, not a bit. She then told the star she would give it more honey if it came with her, and before she knew it, she was back up on the surface, hauling up her catch, a star on the other end of it. Yes, sir, she'd gotten it just like that, though this made her limp all the way back home, slowing things down somewhat. I can tell you this now, she would never toe the line again, you can take that to the bank. So, as I said, Bluest Feather went east to the wide plains, where folk indeed were different from back home. We might say that on account of their land being so gosh darn flat, there was nothing to look at but the sky, nowhere to look but up, which suited them just fine, for that meant they had the world's greatest show on display every day, with nothing to obscure their view. They were deep lovers of the sky, yes, sir, and of the stars, and Bluest Feather felt right at home with them, indeed she did. She found them lying about in a grass the color of gold, looking up and finding shapes in the clouds. And which group of people was this? Well, it was none other than Queenie Cavendish and the Squirrely Burly Boys. Well, she asked them very naively if any stars had fallen down here that she could pick up. Now, any other folk might have laughed at her and told her to get what folk these days might call talk therapy, but they took the question very seriously, and somberly, I might add, and the leader, Queenie, told Bluest Feather that there hadn't been any fallen stars around there for many years. She would have maybe gone home disappointed, but there was hope, so you will see. So these folks were in some ways, we might say, more technologically advanced, all of which was propelled by their celestial preoccupations. They had in fact invented the telescope, the astrolabe, the paper airplane, and most impressive of all, the hot air balloon, a fine achievement, you can't tell me otherwise. They had done this many years ago, after the stars had stopped falling down. But the trouble was that these folks had not invented fire until, well, just last month, so for a long time those hot air balloons were not much use to them until that pivotal moment. So it might be said that Bluest Feather came at just the right time. In fact, when she told them about her quest to catch a star for her Krassmiss tree, though they thought it was a strange notion, they were so touched by her sincerity that they agreed to help. Not only that, but that Queenie Cavendish invited her along on the maiden voyage of their fleet of hot air balloons. Oh, how delighted, how thrilled she was, how Bluest Feather's little heart did soar at Queenie Cavendish's words. So without any more ado, up they went into the various layers of the heavens, till they reached the exosphere, where the clouds at times froze into palaces of crystal. And up here they were among the stars. What sublime beauty they witnessed, and what heavenly joy they felt, no words can relate in any language that I know of, and I know of quite a few. To be sure, a star from the Andromeda being hauled across the earth by a gal with 9 toes is a marvel, as is a fella swallowing one and risking all sorts of internal hemorrhaging. But neither of these can compare to seeing the stars up real close in their very own element. It just so happened that Bluest Feather's balloon floated nearby the closest star of all. Which one was that, of course, but Proxima Centauri, naturally. What else could it be? "There," she said. "That's the one for me." She spent several hours contemplating its beauty, and Queenie Cavendish had to remind her to eat from the picnic basket they brought. But she was happy. That brings us at last to Nickel and Dimes, the unofficial secret competitor in this race. Well, as I said, he went to the west, yes sir, to the deep, deep forest, as it was known back then. It was a forbidding place that few human beings dared go, full of ghouls, goblins, trolls, incubi, succubi, manticores, quicksand, giant Venus flytraps, venture capitalists, insomnia, the ghosts of serial killers, and mosquitoes. Oh, and what an unpleasant place it was! But Nickel and Dimes did not fear it, no sir. He knew its ins and outs, and, in a melancholic sort of manner, felt at home there. And he was acquainted, don't ask me how or why, with one particular creature who was feared more than any other. It was none other than the tinsel serpent. Now this serpent was 100 feet long. If it is a foot, go on, tell me I'm wrong. And instead of scales, it was covered in long, shiny strips of tinsel. What a magnificent monster it was! Nickel and Dimes found it on this occasion hung about the branches of a particularly dead and naked tree. It looked at Nickel and Dimes with its big yellow eyes, deciding whether it should eat the poor fellow, who even he could not help but quiver in his boots just a bit who wouldn't. But Nickel and Dimes knew the protocol better than anybody, and before the serpent could make up its mind, Nickel and Dimes thrust forward a huge red glass ball that glittered even here where the air was choked and the light was pallid and sickly. He presented his offering to the serpent and offered his proposal. "I have a proposal for you," he said. "In exchange for not eating me, I'll take you somewhere where you will have all the shiny things your reptilian heart desires." The serpent loved things that glittered and gleamed. So, after a long, agonizing pause, the serpent simply said, "I'm listening." And so began a most strange and unnerving partnership between man and beast, and we will see the results of this momentarily. When Bare Hands came back into the valley, everybody, I mean everybody, was in a state of distress. What on earth had happened in his absence? In fact, those denizens of the valley were so upset they didn't even take note at first of the miraculous change in Nikolai's appearance. Why, he was positively glowing, and I do not mean that as a figure of speech. He was radiating a golden light from every pore of his being, and some folk had to do a double take before they realized it was Bare Hands and not some kind of cherub. Well, he was approached by Horwitz and some elder folk from the other clans, begging Bare Hands to do something about their predicament. Only they had neglected to inform Bare Hands what precisely the problem was. Oh, they were driven to distraction, they were. So it was up to his cousin Afterface to explain the situation to him, as they walked and talked. When Lady John returned, the same thing happened to her. The Does It Again clan was in such an uproar that they didn't immediately notice that not only did their champion have a star on the end of a rope, getting its sidereal tendrils all covered in honey, but that she was one toe short of a set. Now what in the Sam Hill was going on? Well, they led her to the woods, straight to the biggest, best, most beautiful tree in the valley. And there, coiled round the tree, from the bottom nearly to the very top, was a huge snake-like thing that sparkled in the afternoon sun. Nobody dared go near it for natural fear of being snaked in her. Lady John couldn't tell which end was the head and which the tail until one of the ends started to speak. "What a fine, fine tree this is," said the tinsel serpent. "I think I'll make it my new winter home." Well, everybody was in an uproar then even more, and things were just about to get real ugly, with folk going to fetch their spears, clubs, and cat-o'-nine-tails. But then they heard a familiar voice coming from the tree. "You better listen to the serpent," said the voice. A head popped out of the upper right quarter of the tree. "He'll leave you alone as you decorate his tree with lots of shiny things. He likes those shiny things, don't you, Tinsel?" Yes, sir, it was old Nickel and Dimes himself, sitting on a branch up there gloating. Game's over, folks. Nobody wins this year. Why, if only they could have seen the look of absolute shock on their own faces. What a bunch of rubes, mused Nickel and Dimes. Serves you all right for squabbling over these trees every year like a bunch of ill-mannered children. Now this tree will belong to nobody. No clan's going to build their winter house around it, you hear? It'll just stand out here in the wintertime for all to see and none to have. Well, you can imagine the three competing clans were outraged, especially the Kobolds, the oldest clan that had the biggest sense of entitlement. But the other, smaller clans, well, they did not mind this idea so much. In fact, they had themselves a little old-fashioned quorum among themselves and decided to speak their minds to the three clans, telling them they were in fact in favor of this arrangement so long as the serpent went back to the deep, deep forest after the season was done. The three clans were not happy about this, not a bit, but they couldn't do a thing about it, being outnumbered when all the others got together for an old-fashioned quorum as they did. So, it was decided. The serpent would stay, and Nickel and Dimes had proved his point. In fact, after that day, those other clans looked at him a little differently than before, seeing him not as some sort of gremlin, but a hero, or at the very least a lovable misanthrope. And what about the champions and their stars? Well, Bare Hands was declared to be the first one back in the valley, but there was a problem. He couldn't seem to regurgitate the star. It dawned on him that he might have simply digested the thing, and was now completely diffused with its essence. Indeed, he continued to glow, which was a very beautiful sight, but it did cause problems when he wanted to sleep. And though it mattered little now, he was not declared the winner. Lady John still had her star, however. So she limped to the big tree and asked the serpent real nicely if she could put it on the tippy top. The serpent was especially keen, for being a lover of shiny things, wanted the shiniest thing at the peak to display his splendid wealth and status. Well, Lady John whooped and danced, though being mindful of her foot, this dance was in a somewhat syncopated rhythm. Now, what of our dear Bluest Feather? There was no sign of her, which Nikolai searched for eagerly. It wasn't until a few days later, when he received a word from a messenger pelican that she would not be coming back to the valley, for she had fallen deeply in love with Proxima Centauri and would live in a hot air balloon with her new clan, Queenie and the Squirrely Burly Boys. Well, you can imagine Nikolai was heartbroken at this news, especially to hear it squawked at him by a pelican. Naturally, Bluest Feather's clan was also crestfallen. Indeed, the Sunspot folk developed a bond with Bare Hands after that, softening their rivalry with the Cobalt somewhat. Well, don't worry too much about our Bare Hands. He'll be all right. Sure, he grieved the loss of his sweetheart, but he learned to accept it, and in fact, in his heart of hearts, he thought that it was just as it should be, for that gal was always looking at the stars more than at him. Still, there were plenty of things to remind him of her, so he decided to move up to the mountains to live with Yellow Betty and Nathan the Yeti, and maybe learn some of their skills in woodworking and charioteering. Lady John, though still being regarded as the cleverest of the bunch, was a little more humbled by her misstep. She felt a great sense of responsibility for this star, and came to visit it often, and in turn got to know the serpent, and even struck up a friendship with old Nickel and Dimes. She also became the official safety tsar of the Does It Again clan regarding hunting practices, especially fishing. After that, sure, some folks still decided to build their houses around the trees, and sure, there were still a few small disputes here and there. Old habits die hard, as you know. But the best trees from then on were reserved for the tinsel serpent, and so became, though we cannot rightly call it public property on account of it being the home of a bloodthirsty monster, it became something of a common ground for those folk in the valley. And that's how Krassmiss trees as we know it started. Go on, tell me I'm wrong.